What's happening in the world of physics? Exciting stuff?
Well, yeah, one of the new aspects of the podcast is we have a new segment called Science Matters. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about it because I'm excited about it.
You're a great promoter, man, I'm telling you.
Well, I haven't promoted much in my life about things like that, but I'm very excited by what we're able to do. And it's something that's fun for me. It's a segment called Science Matters where I take science stories that are in the news or maybe should be in the news and actually talk about them for 10 minutes instead of 30-second sound bites to try and get people to look at them and understand them, or at least learn enough that they're interested enough to think about them, or what maybe some things that that are in the news that are nonsense. So there's lots of amazing, every day there's amazing scientific discoveries because of new tools. I mean, for me, our ability to look at the universe in gravitational waves and now is changing our ability to see things that we couldn't see on promoting on Thursday when I give a talk at the How To Academy here. It's going to be on black holes because we've learned an incredible amount. But the most recent Science Matters podcast had three examples of exciting things. One is new developments in understanding how life evolved. We know that, of course, how, since Darwin, how the diversity of life has occurred on Earth by evolution. That's no doubt about it. We understand it, we measured it, we see it. But we still don't know the origin of life. And Darwin thought we'd never learn about the origin of life, but that's because he was living in the 1850s, and we're coming incredibly close to understanding how chemistry can turn into biology. And that, by the way, is important because there's a lot of money that NASA spends on what's called astrobiology, looking for life. And we've made great discoveries of thousands of planets. Until 20 years ago, we knew of 9. I still call Pluto a planet. But now we know around something that many of us astrophysicists already accepted because of the modeling, that most stars have planetary systems around it. What we've learned, as we always learn when we look out and see new things, is that we're surprised, is that there are planetary systems that we thought were physically impossible that exist. We used to think the gas giants had to be in the outer part of solar systems and the rocky planets inside, but we see the opposite in almost anything that can happen does happen out there, which means it's a lot more exciting out there than you imagined. But when people try and say, well, what's the possibility of life out there? One of the key questions that allows us to address that, which we don't have the answer to yet, is how did life evolve on Earth?
Right.
So when you hear about a habitable planet, be skeptical. Maybe there's water on it, but even then it's not clear, for example, just to give you an example. So there's a Goldilocks zone around stars, a region where the temperature of the planet is enough for liquid water, if it exists, to be liquid, not ice or gas. Well, you might argue that the Earth is in a habitable zone, and we are. But even the Earth, if you look at the history of the Earth, because of the distribution of continents in the Earth, 600 to 800 million years ago, the whole Earth froze over solid. It was ice. And then how that dynamics of how that formed, actually Dan Schrag, who we had on the program I talked to you about climate change, was one of the people who first explored that Snowball Earth hypothesis. At the time it was a hypothesis, now there's a great deal of evidence. So even if you're in the habitable zone, if things aren't just right, the whole thing can be frozen. So you have to take that with a great degree of salt. But even further, before we can make realistic estimates of what life there is in the universe, it would be nice to understand what conditions resulted in life on Earth and how it resulted. Because DNA and RNA, even if we lived in an RNA world before a DNA world, RNA is an incredibly complicated molecule. How do we go from no life to life?
Right, from chemicals to biology.
And what is amazing, and a lot of work is being done in the UK on this, by the way, in laboratories in Cambridge and elsewhere, we're getting closer and closer, I think, to seeing at least the conditions and the requirements to have natural chemistry produce complex organic materials and maybe self-replicating materials. In this podcast, I just showed how a big new development, just understanding how the protocells might form. Because to have living systems, they have to be protected from the outside world. You have to have a cell which allows the chemistry to be not disturbed from the outside. And I'll just give you a simple example because I did it on the program. So there are these things called fatty acids, and they look like tadpoles with a big head and a tail. And it turns out the big head likes water. The chemistry of it is it wants to be attracted to H2O. The tail is repelled by it, okay? So what happens if you have a bunch of them? They line up so the heads are facing the water and the tails are inside. What does that do? It produces a circle or a sphere that the inside is protected from the outside. Great. Could fatty acids be a natural precursor to cells? Yes, but there was a well-known problem. If you put them in salt water or magnesium or other things, they're no longer stable. And of course, the early oceans had salt water, and so how could you have this? What some young researcher just discovered with her supervisor, they were in Washington, was magical, at least magical to me and magical to them, is that they were playing around and they said, well, if you have amino acids, which are the basis of proteins that drive human biology, and amino acids, by the way, are prevalent throughout the cosmos. They occur naturally in comets and asteroids and everything else. But if you put amino acids at the same time as you have these fatty acids, what you discover is that if you fill up this sphere with amino acids, it's stable. So here is the thing. So suddenly if you have the building blocks of proteins, they make the thing that might form a cell stable. So it's just remarkable. It means that naturally you could form a system that has all of the constituents that later on you'd want to have for life, and it's only stable if they're all there. What a wonderful development. Now, we don't know how it actually happened, but I thought it'd be fun to talk about, and it's the kind of thing I could talk about with a little diagram behind me that was understandable. There's another thing I talked about in the episode, which is a claimed controversy that I was reading the papers. Oh, cosmology is breaking down. I always read this every few weeks. Some discovery means everything we know is wrong, which of course is not true. But it's a weird controversy. We try and measure the expansion of the universe different ways and we come up with different numbers, measurably different numbers. Now, there's two possibilities. Either the measurements are wrong, or there's something fundamentally wrong with our picture in cosmology. And a number of distinguished astronomers are saying that the numbers are different enough that we have to rechange everything we think about how the universe evolved from early times to now. And so I wanted to explore that in a way that would actually give the data to the public to say, is this a controversy? I don't happen to think it is as bad as some, but I wanted to show the data, explain what it implied. And so I did that. And the last thing, which is very exciting from a technological and business perspective, is quantum computing and quantum teleportation and all. And why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because those developments will change the way we do business. Because, for example, your credit card works because you can encode a key and so that the bank knows it's you and someone else doesn't take money out of your bank account. And so encryption and key coding is an incredible part of what makes the bank system stable. And the way it's encoded is what are called large prime numbers. It turns out that if you take a large number, every number can be described as the product of primes. But if you take a large enough number, right now it would take any computer longer than the history of the universe to determine what the primes are that make up that number. So banks have big, large numbers that they've created by the multiplication of primes, and they know what those prime numbers are, and they use that as a code, and so you can't break that code. But one of the things that was realized is that quantum computers, which can compute differently, and if you want to talk about them, we can. I certainly did in the podcast, but they will allow you, in principle, to do kind of calculations that would allow you to figure out the prime factors of a large number in a finite time. And if you had a quantum computer, therefore, you could break the codes that all banks are using, and that would cause a problem. Okay, so that's why national security agencies and others are working on quantum computers. But at the same time, while there's a problem, there's a neat opportunity. Quantum mechanics also not allowed, in principle, quantum computers, but something called quantum teleportation, where I can basically quantum mechanically reproduce the quantum state of one system very far away instantaneously. And we don't need to go into that now. Again, I tried to on my program. But that's fascinating, and it's a wonderful bit of technology, and it's been shown. People have now done in China and other places have done quantum teleportation from here to satellites, okay? But what that does is if you can do that quantum mechanically, you can actually you can encode things so that anyone who's measuring something here can see if there was an eavesdropper listening in between the time the signal was created and the time the signal was received. And that would allow you to see if anyone was eavesdropping and breaking your codes. So what I wanted to point out is that the world of the 21st century may depend on quantum mechanics in ways that it hasn't yet. And at the level of the sort of interface between forefront physics and technology, quantum mechanics is the place to be. And every day there are new discoveries that are fascinating. And the quantum world is crazy, but it's fascinating, and it's not just obscure. It's not something that's just the domain of people like me. And, you know, speaking of flat earthers, I mean, you depend on quantum mechanics every day. My phone wouldn't work if we didn't have semiconductors and use the properties of quantum mechanics. So these developments from quantum computing to understanding the universe are not esoteric. They help us understand our place in the universe, and they're also, I think, fascinating. And people can maybe not understand the details, not the mathematical details, but people can appreciate the context. And that's why I think it's important to talk about science in the news, because pretty well every aspect of our modern society in some way or another depends upon science. And too often we just think science is a black box and we shouldn't talk about it in the news or in the media or in movies or in fun discussions. But I think people are fascinated by it and they can appreciate it, and it will impact on their lives, which is because, getting back to climate change, basic aspects of climate change are understandable and should be understood by every literate person in a society, so that we can make appropriate democratic judgments about how we're going to act.